Did you know that nowhere in the Bible does it say that you can move mountains? My name is Taylor. I have come to love the Bible, and I want to help you understand it. The idea that you can move mountains is typically pulled from Mark 11, verse 23, and the same quotation in the rest of the Synoptic Gospels, but I want to draw your attention to something about the verse in particular. Two things to notice. Number one, mountain is singular, which means Jesus is referencing one mountain, and to reinforce this point, the word "this" there exists in our English translations. And what's important to note is the word "this" is there in the English because the demonstrative pronoun is there in the Greek. That is, when Jesus is making this point, he is literally pointing at the Jerusalem Mount that they are sitting on. First thing this teaches us is that at no point does Jesus say carte blanche, you can literally go around and move whatever mountain you want. It is a singular mountain that he has in view, and it is a specific mountain that he has in view, and we need to think about what role it plays in the biblical narrative. In Israel's understanding of what God is doing in the world, he has chosen Jerusalem to be the mountain of his dwelling place. This is from Psalm 132. For the Lord has chosen Zion, or Jerusalem. He has desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. That's referring to the Jerusalem Mount, which is the location where Solomon built God's glorious temple for him to dwell in. The reason this is significant is because when Jesus says you can move this mountain, he had just entered Jerusalem and the temple complex. At the beginning of Mark 11, you have here the triumphal entry. And when Jesus entered, many spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut from the fields, and they sang this song down in verse 10. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David, Hosanna in the highest, which is a quotation of Psalm 118, a great psalm of expectation when the Davidic king enters Jerusalem, especially into the temple, where there's expected to be a great festival of his arrival. But anticlimactically, Jesus enters Jerusalem and goes into the temple, looks around, and he leaves. In other words, he was not received in the way he should have been, and that's immediately going to begin the sandwich of the cursing of the fig tree. The fig tree, of course, is something that gives the appearance that it is bearing fruit, but doesn't have any actual fruit in it, which is a parable of what's happening with the Jerusalem temple. All sorts of activity, but no actual fruit for the glory of God and helping the nations come to know their Creator. So in between the cursing of the fig tree, Jesus goes in and he quotes Isaiah. Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers? In other words, the one thing the Temple Mount on Jerusalem was for was so that Israel could be a light to the nations, so that the nations could come to know their Creator. The burden in view in the biblical narrative is that Israel used God as their token for their own health and wealth, rather than bearing spiritual fruit of witnessing to the goodness of God and living a moral and upright life that takes care of the captives, that helps the widows, that helps the orphans, binds up their wounds, and instead Israel just used the temple to make a bunch of money. It's within this context and the failure of Jerusalem to bear the fruit on the Temple Mount as it was chosen to do that Jesus now responds to Peter's pointing out that the fig tree has cursed and withered. In other words, Jesus is calling down God's curse upon the current temple system. And it's there that he says, have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe you've received it, and it will be yours. Well, what in the world is the idea of prayer for? Well, in this context, Israel was supposed to turn the temple into a place where the nations could come to pray and seek their God. It's about bearing spiritual fruit of discipleship and calling the nations to worship God. That is, in context, it's not just this carte blanche promise that you can do whatever miracles that you think will impress the people around you. It's about making a morally upright people called under Israel's king to follow him and to take the gospel to the nations. When Jesus says that you can move this mountain, he's saying now, because of the disciples' partnership with Christ, they're going to bear far more fruit than the Jerusalem Temple Mount ever did. They're going to be able to go to the nations in a way that Israel failed to bring the nations to them. In other words, while it is true that God can do any miracle that he wants, and he does choose to do so from time to time, the point of being able to move this mountain is the confidence that we have that as we go forth and make disciples, bearing fruit as the Lord has commanded, Jesus promises to be with us, and God's power will go with us as we call all nations to come and know Christ.